All right, welcome back to part 6. Gonna make it through. Uh, so following up on the House of the Faun, I'm going to move to another house in Pompeii. This one from one of the readings for this week, the House of the Ephebe. So here you can see what it may have looked like from the outside, and here is one version of a plan. So if you think back to the House of the Faun and to that idealized domus plan that you saw before, it's getting a little bit more difficult to see exactly where those ideal placement of rooms, that ideal arrangement is coming from here. So if I look at the plan again, here you can see that there is 2 street entrances, one here and one here. There's another one back here actually, but it's from outside. And here we have that atrium, the room with the open roof and the pool. And then around that atrium again are spread some other smaller rooms, activity spaces. And then we sort of do move back out into a garden area. We have 4 columns to kind of provide a covered space in the garden. But this plan is much more organic and more realistically typical than the stereotypical simplified version of the Roman house. So that's just another thing to keep in mind as we start looking next week towards domestic spaces a little bit more deeply. So primarily we're going to be talking about, very quickly, the outdoor triclinium. So here's a picture of it from the reading that you did. And then if we turned ourselves around, so if we're looking southeast towards the triclinium, and then we turned ourselves around and looked northwest from within that triclinium area, triclinium being a dining room, we have this interesting sort of permeable wooden wall. This is a reconstruction, but there does seem to have been some sort of enclosure mechanism that was temporary and allowed this outdoor dining space to connect to what is an indoor dining space. On the plan in the Barrett book, this is room 17. And if we sort of, the left of this image here, if you look out from that direction, you will see the outdoor triclinium. The word triclinium means 3 couches. And so here you can see 2 of the 3 sides of the dining couch. Just like outside, you can see this 3-sided dining couch as well. So when the Romans would dine, they would arrange themselves 3 people to a couch for an idealized party of 9. So we have our 4th style wall decorations here. We have opening to the outside. We have strained floating figures. We have attenuated skinny bits of architecture. So the House of the Ephebe, the decoration was done in the 4th style for the most part. So that is that period from about 30 CE up to 79 CE. 45 CE to 79 CE is maybe better, the 4th style. Just a little detail down here, you can see these painted plants which are coming up basically from ground level and sprouting up at the bottom all the way around the triclinium, lining all the areas behind the couches here. So if you think about the sort of architectural openings to the outside that are being painted here in a sort of mythological realm, where we have figures floating in the air. And then we have this sort of interesting depiction of abstracted local fauna and flora. We have our little bird here for fauna, all looking out towards this outside triclinium that we will look at momentarily. Another just brief detail, we have these opus sectile cutwork floors where different colored marble types are inlaid in designs to sort of highlight, again, vegetal motifs, exotic materials that have to be imported from different parts of the empire. So a sort of a physical manifestation of trade networks in these opus sectile floors, where you see Giallo Antico from Egypt, and I don't really know my marbles, but there's a lot of different sort of colors, and they come from very specific regions, brought together into, again, this same triclinium room. So just where the couches are not, that's where we see this fancy opus sectile floor. So turning back outside now, looking at the painted triclinium masonry couches out here, something that's really interesting that we see is that the architecture of the space is set up to sort of, similar to the Alexander sarcophagus, bring up a religious idea, to sort of connote household religion. This niche at the back is actually a fountain, and water would spill down these steps, and then somehow run around here, around the table, at the center. But it also looks very much like a household altar, a lararium niche, which is something you would commonly find in a garden area of a house. So we have a sort of interesting connection between the outside space here as an entertainment area, but also as a potentially sacred area. And if you look at these paintings, these are the Nilotic paintings that we see. This back wall had a very large hunt scene painted on it that's highly damaged, so I didn't find a good picture of it to show you. If we look a little bit more closely at these, on the left side, we see another shrine scene. So we have a portico with a shrine within, another little shrine over here to the side, and all these tiny little figures doing activities in this sacro-idyllic space. It doesn't look super specifically Nilotic, this one scene, but in context with all of the other scenes that we have on the masonry couch here, it certainly is. If we look at, so this is here, if we look at this image a little bit more closely, this is what we see. So it's quite different. We have an erotic scene with a man and a woman playing pipes here, a very short, stocky man over here, and then we have a black man back here. So again, sort of hinting that we're down in Egypt, hinting at these Nubians, these darker skinned people who were from the southern part of Egypt and Nubia. So we have two very different kinds of scenes showing up. We have an erotic scene with music, which may sort of recall the kind of dining activities, the sort of looseness of a dining party that you might have while you're actually here in this outside garden, but also recalling this sort of shrine-like sacred atmosphere that is being recalled by the architecture as well. So both things in one spot. I don't have good images of the rest of the Egyptian paintings on the bench, although I think Caitlin Barrett in her article does a good job showing and describing why they are interesting and important. So instead, I wanted to show you a couple other Egyptianizing images from other Pompeian houses that also pick up on some of these same elements. So this is from the House of the Doctor. Again, a fourth style painting set very clearly in a Nilotic area. We have our hippopotamus, we have our alligator, crocodile. We have two crocodiles here. We have people drowning in the river, being attacked by the hippopotamus. We have pygmies, these very tiny, undersized people who are sort of stereotypically used in Egyptianizing scenes frequently. Again, as a sort of distancing factor to show that Egypt is exotic. It's a strange upside down world where sometimes the gods have animal heads and pharaohs in the Ptolemaic period and, marry their siblings, right? So it's like upside down world. Egypt, very strange to our Romans. Not to say that the Romans didn't do plenty of strange things on their own. But they did tend to use Egypt as a sort of sounding board, as a place where we could play out ideas of perversion in a safe and distant, not us, other location. You can also sort of see from the interesting crocodile here that the artist doesn't seem to have traveled to Egypt or to have firsthand knowledge of what crocodiles look like. We talked about that a little bit. Same with the hippo here. These sort of look like hybrid animals. This honestly looks like a dinosaur. So it's not a veristic image, right? This is not like our Alexander mosaic where it is trying to be a sort of documentary, highly specific, all the characteristics of the art are picked out in detail. This is more of a caricature that we are seeing of Egypt in these scenes. Here's just a detail here of our pygmy fighting the crocodile on the left with an ibis, a bird up here. And then some more scenes of our pygmies down here. And we have our person who has been attacked by the hippopotamus. So thinking about the sort of using Egypt as a space for caricature and for showing strange activities done by only semi-human people, these short people who don't, pygmies. What does that, think a little bit, what does that mean to you to sort of have that in your garden? If you have this sort of dining area where you're partying that is picking up on maybe the connections between the natural world and religion, but also picking up on this sort of exoticizing imagery of Egypt. How do you think that this sort of context and iconography work together? Just something to think about. Here's a couple maybe answers to think about. Feel free to disagree with them, of course, and I would love to hear your thoughts on these questions next week when we talk. So one thing might be sort of an inside local, outside exotic dichotomy, where we saw in the internal triclinium local looking imagery, paintings on the walls that very strongly recall the very contemporary Roman style of painting. This would have been quite up to date at the time that this room was being used. It's not antiquated at all. Versus this exoticizing foreign imagery of Egypt that is placed in this outdoor triclinium, so not inside the house, but out in the garden, closer to the natural world, closer to uncontrolled space in reality. There's also mentioned in Caitlin Barrett's article, the Herms, those statues with a sort of block body and just a head on top. Those recall Greece very strongly. So you have not only Egyptianizing imagery outside in this area, but also Greek imagery outside in this area. So maybe that also says something about not necessarily isolating Egypt as particularly conquerable, but just one among the many areas that the Romans have control over. So we see a sort of almost casual ability to master the universe, right? Like I can put, as a Roman, as a person who lives in this culture that controls so much of the world, I can have Egypt, I can have Rome, I can have Greek cultural and artistic characteristics all in my space for me. And this video is almost out of time, but there's one more thing that I want you to think about, which is miniaturization. What happens when in art, rather than like in the Alexander mosaic or the Alexander sarcophagus, you make a very large, imposing image? What happens when this image becomes miniaturized and tiny? What does that do for the viewer? Something to think about as well as we come back for what should be our last video.